This is the Stalag Luft, the third prisoner of war camp, built in just 2 years amid the dense forests of Sagern, 145 kilometers southeast of Berlin. It became one of the largest prisoner of war camps of its kind in Europe, designed specifically for captured Allied aircrew officers. This vast high-security complex held between 10,000 and 12,000 prisoners at its peak. But what truly made it famous was not what you see above ground, but what you would not see below. It was the secret underground tunnel that made possible the greatest prison escape in history. Europe, 1944. By this point, World War II was no longer a war of bold plans and swift victories. It had become a total war of attrition, in which every participating nation was drawn into the same inescapable machinery of violence. For Nazi Germany, although Hitler and his regime continued to loudly proclaim victory and racial superiority, the reality on the battlefield was entirely different. In the East, the Soviet Red Army was advancing with overwhelming force, pushing the front lines deep toward German territory. In the West, the remaining Allied nations were quietly preparing for the largest amphibious invasion in human history, creating a pincer movement from which Nazi Germany could not escape. And that was not all. In the skies above, bomber formations appeared with increasing frequency, not only destroying factories and railways, but also striking directly at the morale of German society. Propaganda still spoke of final victory, but the air raid sirens that sounded every night seemed to shatter those lies. Yet it was precisely because of the intensity of these bombing campaigns that tens of thousands of Allied pilots were shot down during operations over German-occupied territory and became prisoners of war. They were not anonymous soldiers, but professionally trained officers with independent minds. Under the Geneva Conventions, captured officers could not be forced into hard labor. That meant they had time to think, to observe, and to plan escapes. For Nazi Germany, each such prisoner was a potential source of instability. An escape, even by a single individual, forced the security apparatus to respond, to mobilize police, military units, and the Gestapo to conduct a manhunt. At a time when every soldier was needed at the front, this was a waste that Berlin could not easily accept. For that reason, so-called escape-proof prisoner of war camps were created, and Stalag Luft III was one of the most representative products of that way of thinking. It was a facility carefully calculated, born out of Nazi Germany's obsession with the repeated escape attempts of Allied airmen. The camp was directly administered by the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, beginning operations in March 1942 and remaining in use until early 1945. It was built near the town of Sagern, now Żagań in Poland. But why was it known as a place from which escape was impossible? The answer lay in its location. Stalag Luft III was built on deep, dry, loose sand, a type of soil that, when excavated, revealed a color sharply different from the surface layer. The deep sand made any attempt to escape by tunneling almost impossible. Such tunnels would face constant collapse, would be difficult to reinforce, and most importantly, the large volume of excavated sand would be extremely hard to conceal. But the camp's geology was not the only factor. The barracks where prisoners were housed were raised above the ground, leaving open space beneath them to prevent prisoners from digging tunnels inside. Underground, a network of microphones was buried densely around the camp to detect vibrations, a form of crude seismic eavesdropping. Primitive but sufficient to create the sense that every shovel strike could be heard. The entire design carried a cold message. You cannot escape. In terms of security, that was the reality. Yet Stalag Luft III was markedly different in its treatment of prisoners compared with many other Nazi camps of the time. It adhered relatively closely to the Geneva Conventions. Officer prisoners were exempt from forced labor, allowed to receive letters from their families, and supplied with food parcels from the Red Cross. There was a library, sports fields, and even a dedicated space for theatrical performances to entertain the prisoners. To an outsider, it might seem almost tolerable. Being a prisoner under such conditions did not appear so terrible. They could make use of these amenities until their captivity ended or the war was over, returning to their families without having to face the battlefield or risk their lives. But that very humanity created a dangerous paradox that slowly eroded the minds of Allied officers. The reason was simple. When human beings are not crushed physically, they turn to something far harder to control: the mind. And it was precisely within that seemingly comfortable environment that escape attempts inevitably began to take shape. It was not hunger or beatings, but the feeling of being suspended in an indefinite state of waiting. Allied pilots who had been shot down had often passed through several other camps before being brought here. They understood the procedures. They understood that the war could last for years more, and that every month in captivity was a month removed from the fight. For men trained to act, to fight for their country, even to sacrifice their lives for it. Many believed that dying in the line of duty was far more honorable than living in the suffocating confinement of a prison like this. Being forced to wait was itself one of the cruelest forms of psychological torture. At Stalag Luft III, the silence did not bring peace. It only made thoughts heavier, and the question, "What can we still do to get out of here?" circled endlessly in every prisoner's mind. From that state of mind, escape gradually transformed from a personal desire into a collective objective. It became a shared goal, a contribution to their country. Escaping was no longer merely an impulse, but part of an unfinished duty to the war effort. They no longer had aircraft or weapons, but they still had the ability to inflict losses on the enemy in another way. For a regime built on the image of absolute control like Nazi Germany, every successful escape was a public crack in the story it told its own people. It demonstrated that the system was not all-powerful, that order could be challenged. For the prisoners, a successful escape would become a symbol. Escape was not only for freedom, but to prove that they had never truly been subdued. However, the prisoners clearly understood that small, uncoordinated efforts would lead only to failure and retaliation. Therefore, if an escape were to be attempted, it would have to be carried out on a large scale, carefully planned, and with a real chance of success. The escape was scheduled for the night of March 24th, extending into the early hours of March 25th, 1944. But for months before that, beneath Stalag Luft III, a parallel world had already existed. Tunnels dug in silence, wooden boards dismantled piece by piece, powdered milk tins turned into ventilation ducts, and hundreds of men working with the highest levels of unity and discipline. All of it was prepared for a single moment in which every passing minute would carry the value of a human life. From April 1943 to March 1944, they did not dig just one tunnel, but deliberately undertook three at the same time. The three tunnels, codenamed Tom, Dick, and Harry, were designed as independent structures, each with its own entrance and with no connections between them. This arrangement ensured that if one tunnel was discovered, the other two would still have a chance to remain secret. The total number of participants was very large, around 600 prisoners from the United States, Britain, and many European countries. Structurally, the tunnels were dug at a depth of more than 7 meters below the surface to avoid the vibration detection devices the Germans had buried around the camp. The tunnel walls were reinforced with wooden slats taken from bedboards, tables, chairs, and other camp furnishings, helping prevent the sand from collapsing. The interior space was extremely cramped, just large enough for one person to crawl through, yet it was still fitted with a crude ventilation system and small rail tracks for transporting sand, tools, and even people. Each tunnel entrance was also carefully concealed. The access points to Tom, Dick, and Harry were hidden beneath familiar objects in the barracks, such as stoves or floorboards, making them difficult to detect during routine inspections. Thanks to their separated structure, solid reinforcement, and organized construction carried out by specialized teams, these three tunnels became one of the most sophisticated escape engineering projects ever carried out in wartime prisoner-of-war camps. Secrecy alone was not enough. they also had to account for the German use of listening devices to detect digging. For that reason, the tunnels were dug to a depth of about 7.6 meters to reduce the chance that microphones would pick up sound or unusual vibrations. But this created another problem. Digging that deep meant that the volume of sand that had to be removed was enormous, more dangerous to handle, and required stronger reinforcement to prevent collapse. At the same time as digging, they had to be largely self-sufficient in materials in an environment that was almost completely controlled. Since it was impossible to bring wood or steel into the camp openly, the organizers devised a way to make the Germans unknowingly supply the materials themselves. How? Many items in the camp, beds, chairs, tables, benches, were reported as broken or simply disappeared, prompting the prison authorities to replace them. As a result, the prisoners gained a steady supply of wood and components for reinforcement, collapse prevention, and tool-making. They exploited the camp's own logistics process to sustain the escape project, while making everything appear to be nothing more than the normal wear and tear of a crowded compound. The administration of Stalag Luft III did notice that some items were being replaced with unusually high frequency. The camp commandant, Colonel Friedrich von Lindeiner, recorded that the amount of material required for this camp is 5 times greater than that allocated to German soldiers living under the same conditions. Yet instead of thoroughly investigating the source of the problem, they simply resupplied the camp. And in practice, the Germans inadvertently helped those planning the escape. But as the tunnels grew longer, the prisoners realized that digging them was difficult. But operating them was even harder. Moving people and sand through such a narrow, dark, and deep space was no easy task. To solve this, they devised a rail system and small carts running along the tunnels. With these carts, bringing tools deep inside and hauling sand out became faster and less physically exhausting, while also reducing the amount of time spent working near the tunnel entrance, an area where activity was easier to hear, see, or catch during surprise inspections. A long tunnel was only meaningful if there was an efficient way to transport materials. Otherwise, digging productivity would drop sharply, and the longer the trapdoor was opened each night, the greater the risk. The next challenge was how to dispose of the excavated sand. Sand from deep underground was yellow, while the surface sand in the compound was gray. Dumping it carelessly would immediately give them away. So they organized a dedicated dispersal team of more than 100 men, nicknamed the Penguins. These men hid sand in pouches, in the legs of their trousers, or in modified coats, then gradually scattered it around the camp yard while walking about as usual. They even mixed in small stones to reduce the color contrast and deceive the eye. What was remarkable was that this was not a series of isolated acts, but a repeated systematic process requiring tight coordination and discipline. Where to scatter the sand, when to do it, how much to spread, whether lookouts were in place. Everything had to be precisely synchronized. To keep every link in the chain running smoothly, lookout duty was organized just as carefully as the digging itself. Rotating watch schedules were used to sound the alarm when guards approached, allowing the diggers to stop immediately, close the trapdoor, and conceal all traces before inspections. The pressure was even greater because the camp had its own team of tunnel hunters, ferrets, who conducted searches. A single surprise inspection hitting a weak point, a strange sound, sand of the wrong color, a piece of furniture out of place, could cause the entire network to unravel. Therefore, the lookouts were not only protecting the diggers, but also safeguarding the entire system of concealment and dispersal. By September 1943, the tunnel Tom had been dug to a length of about 220 feet and had even passed beyond the perimeter fence. However, a guard noticed traces of yellow sand appearing on the ground in the camp, prompting the Germans to immediately tighten surveillance. In the early morning of September 8, 1943, prisoners in Barracks 123 were awakened for a surprise inspection. During the search, a guard probed the floor with a rod and nearly fell through the tunnel entrance. After discovering it, the Germans photographed the tunnel and then placed explosives to destroy Tom. Even so, the plan of digging 3 tunnels proved its value. and after thwarting another escape attempt, the guards' level of vigilance eased somewhat. However, Roger Bushell remained cautious. Roger, who was regarded as the central figure of the plan, was described as capable, intelligent, and possessing an almost absolute focus, showing that he was not merely a participant, but the guiding force directing the entire escape operation, the man who oversaw every stage of the process. When the winter of 1943 arrived, work on the remaining 2 tunnels was temporarily suspended. As the weather began to warm and the ground started to thaw, he decided that the final phase of the plan had to be accelerated. A new problem emerged: how to dispose of the excavated sand. Because although the coldest period had passed, snow still covered the ground, making the yellow sand easy to detect. At that time, the tunnel Dick was only about 60 feet long, while Harry had progressed much more successfully. Bushell therefore decided to concentrate all efforts on Harry and to fill in Dick using sand taken from Harry itself. By early March 1944, the tunnel Harry had reached a length of nearly 368 feet and had passed beyond the camp fence. And on the fateful day, as night fell, the prison camp settled into a silence like any other night. But beneath the ground, something was in motion. There were no shouted orders, no unnecessary movements. About 200 selected men gathered in a barracks, sitting close together, carrying forged documents, civilian clothing, a small amount of money, and a plan they had rehearsed in their minds until it was memorized. Tunnel Harry was ready. On the night of the escape, everything had been carefully planned down to the exact order in which each man would go. Those judged to have the highest chances of getting away were sent first, to increase the likelihood that someone would make it out and report back to the Allied side. Among them, about 30 prisoners who spoke fluent German were given top priority. They were issued the small sums of money that had been accumulated and sent ahead so they could reach the railway station near the camp before the last train of the night, hoping to blend in and leave the area as quickly as possible. The remaining prisoners followed in the predetermined sequence. Most of them had no means of traveling by train and would have to move on foot, each carrying his own plan for reaching territory controlled by the Allies. The line of men moved one after another along the rails inside the tunnel. When the first group began trying to open the exit to the outside, new difficulties struck. The ground above was frozen solid, and the hatch could not be opened. It took more than an hour of struggling in darkness and freezing cold before they finally forced an opening. And when the last layer of earth was pushed aside, they realized a deadly mistake. The tunnel was shorter than expected. Instead of emerging in the forest, they would have to crawl out into open ground, directly within sight of the guard towers. The plan stood on the brink of collapse. But at that moment, Roger Bushell clearly demonstrated his role as a leader. A temporary solution was devised immediately: to use a rope and a lookout to signal when the guards turned their backs. The lookout would position himself at the edge of a wooded area, hiding inside an observation post that the Germans themselves had built to watch the camp from a distance. At intervals, he would pull a rope leading back to the exit to signal that it was safe. And so, one by one, the men crawled up onto the frozen ground, pressed themselves flat against the snow, and disappeared into the darkness. Each time a shadow slipped out of the tunnel mouth, the clock kept running. Time was the greatest enemy. The closer it came to dawn, the greater the risk of discovery. But the line of men continued. At that point, stopping was more dangerous than continuing. In the span of about 6 hours, despite the initial delays, 76 prisoners escaped from Stalag Luft III. That number alone was a shock for a camp designed to be escape-proof. Yet this victory was more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. At 4:55 a.m., just over half an hour before dawn, disaster struck. One of the escapees misunderstood the tug on the rope as a signal that it was safe to leave the tunnel. When he emerged, he came face to face with a patrolling guard. After a brief moment of surprise, the guard regained his composure, fired a warning shot, blew his whistle, and captured the man at gunpoint. The escape had been discovered, and conditions were even worse for those who had successfully gotten out of the camp. The biting cold, deep snow, and frozen ground made travel slow and exhausting. Many of them did not speak German fluently, which was a major obstacle. Railway lines were tightly controlled. Almost all of Germany was placed on alert. A single small mistake, a wrong answer, an invalid ticket, a suspicious glance, was enough to trigger a chain of events that could not be reversed. One by one, in small groups or alone, they were recaptured in the days and weeks that followed. Some were exposed by the weather, some by exhaustion, others by a minor error that led to discovery. This manhunt was not only about capturing fugitives. It was meant to send a message. No one could challenge the system without paying the price. When news that 76 prisoners had escaped reached Berlin, Adolf Hitler regarded it not merely as a security failure, but as a personal insult. And it demanded a sacrifice to conceal the fragility of the system. Hitler's first reaction was to order the shooting of all those who were recaptured. It was an impulsive command, yet entirely consistent with the way he had conducted the war, using extreme violence to crush any sign of defiance. In the end, under pressure from several generals who feared diplomatic and legal consequences, the order was revised. Not all of them, but more than half. The final number was set at 50. 50 of the recaptured prisoners were executed immediately, including the driving force behind the escape, Roger Bushel. The directives from Berlin were issued discreetly, coldly, and with calculation. Prisoners were to be interrogated, then reported as being returned to camp, and along the way they would be shot under the pretext of attempting to escape. No witnesses, no transparent records, no truth left behind. The task of carrying out this order was assigned to the Gestapo, an apparatus already accustomed to doing what others would not. The executions took place across Germany, by roadsides, in forests, at unnamed locations. The scenario was nearly always the same. Prisoners were told they were being transferred to another camp, ordered to step out of the vehicle to rest, and then shot from behind. When the war ended, what had once been hidden behind falsified paperwork and internal reports began to come to light. Allied investigations quickly determined that the execution of 50 prisoners was a blatant violation of the Geneva Conventions, one that could not be justified by any military necessity. Many Gestapo officers involved in the killings were tracked down, arrested, and brought to trial in the post-war years. Some received long prison sentences. Others were sentenced to death. For many of them, the familiar defense was that they were only following orders, a phrase that would later become a symbol of the moral irresponsibility of an entire system. Now, when we look back at the escape from Stalag Luft III, the meaning of the event runs even deeper. Stalag Luft III was built to prove that human will could be subdued by engineering, planning, and fear. The escape refuted that assumption. It showed that the spirit of resistance does not disappear when weapons are taken away. It merely changes form. For the prisoners, escaping was not simply about finding a way to survive. It was the only way to affirm that they were still human beings with the right to choose, not merely subjects to be managed. In the context of a war in which totalitarian regimes sought to control both thought and behavior, the act of daring to take action, even while knowing the likely consequences, carried a symbolic value far greater than the practical outcome. If Stalag Luft III is placed alongside other escapes in the history of warfare, the difference lies in its scale and level of organization. Many prisoner of war camps saw bold escapes, some even more successful in terms of the number of men who got away. But few places ever turned escaper into a collective campaign lasting years, involving hundreds of participants and a support system so complex, disciplined, and sustained. Stalag Luft III was not the only escape, but it was the one that forced an entire regime to reveal its limits. For that reason, it holds a special place in the history of World War II, not as a military victory, but as a moment when human beings, even when pushed into their weakest position, still possessed the power to shake a system that seemed impregnable.